Thank you all for coming to this session. The fact it is now standing room only shows the importance of the topic. It couldn't be more timely. Really pleased to welcome Will Linden from the Scottish Violence Reduction Unit. Joined the unit in 2005. It was the first unit to take a public health approach to policing, set up in response to the knife crime crisis in Glasgow. He describes his unit as spectacular people doing spectacular things. And I think that's evidenced by there has been a 47% reduction in Scottish homicides. And in the year 2016 to 17, there was not a single fatal stabbing of an under 20-year-old anywhere throughout Scotland, not just in Glasgow. So fantastic work, and it's no wonder that you have acted as a magnet, not just for forces from around England and Wales, but internationally. And we're really pleased you could join us, and we are all yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Who's all got a hangover this morning? No loud noises, no brutal scenes of violence, nothing. Okay. I'm delighted to be here. As Kate said, we were set up in 2004-2005 after when we were described as the murder capital of Western Europe. With a homicide rate that was second to none, we were horrific in the levels of violence. But it was the fact is that it wasn't just that 1 year. Scotland had been on a trajectory that was heading in the wrong direction. It had been generational stuff. We looked at the analysis, we looked at everything that we'd done, and we showed that despite policing's best efforts, and it was policing's best efforts, we had plenty of cops on the streets, we were detecting our homicides at a level of about 97, 98%. We were doing great work, but the violence was heading in the wrong direction. It's only when we started to dig into the triggers and the causes of the violence we realised, actually, we've a limited utility in what we can do. We've a limited way of actually tackling those triggers. How do we go about tackling the housing problem? How do we go about tackling issues such as mental health or addiction? So we need to look beyond that, and that's what we did. We thought to ourselves, well, if we can't handle it, who can? And we started down a pathway of actually looking at our partners, working in collaboration, and looking at those very drivers of the violence rather than the symptoms of itself. Now, a few years ago, there's been a lot of media storm this year over the Violence Reduction Unit because of, obviously it's caused out of London. You know, the London-based media decide to then have a look at the problem, then it's the world's problem. So end up, it comes to Scotland, everyone wants to look at Scotland. But actually, this is not the first time this has happened before. Following the Tottenham riots a few years ago when the riots spread throughout the country, we were name-checked in Parliament about the gangs work that we did, because it was a gangs problem, apparently. And we were asked to come down to brief the Cabinet Office about it. And on our way down, we found two quotes. Oops, just gave it away there. What has happened to our young people? They disrespect their elders, they disobey their parents, they ignore the law, they riot in the streets, morals are decaying. The world is passing through troubled times. The young think of nothing but themselves. As for girls, they are forward, immodest, unladylike in their speech, behaviour and dress. Now, those comments there could come from the Daily Mail, could come from blogs. But the reality of it is that Plato, 5th century BC, and Peter the Hermit, 13th century AD. We've always looked on young people's behaviour with suspicion. We've always looked through rose-coloured spectacles at the past. We always think it was better before than it is today. It's natural, we do that. We look back with this kind of rose-coloured sort of ambition about how good it was when we were younger. Now, for those of you who lived through the 1980s, in terms of the levels of violence, such as football violence and violence in the streets, there was significant levels of violence. If you actually look at worldwide trends in homicide and violence, we're safer today than we were yesterday. And that's even after the last night about all the worldwide trends in violence and terrorism, etc. We're actually safer today. And the trajectory is still downwards. So when we look at what's happening today, we need to consider a couple of things. One, me as a middle-aged white man, I have no idea what it's like to be a young boy living in, say, Hackney. I have no idea what it's like to be a young boy living in just a house in Glasgow. And I will never have any idea what it's like to be a young girl. But me as a middle-aged, middle-class man, well-educated, I'm in that realms a decision maker. I make decisions. I set strategies, I set policy, I set direction. Very often based on sometimes my skewed view. So when we talk about collaboration and we talk about working with partners, we have to include those that we work with most. That is those who we describe as victims, offenders, in the community. We have to listen to them. We have to listen to what's driving their issues. We have to listen to the problems that they have. We have to listen to the solutions that they have. And not just think that we know best, because sometimes we don't. And that's one of the things about the VRU and what we've always did, is actually come from a position that actually we don't have the answers. The answers are out there. And what we do is we try and find them. We try and find the right people, the right partners, and the right friends to listen to and to work with. Scotland, for the last 10 years, has been on a total downward trajectory. We're still going down. Our crime, possibly levelling out, but when you look at it against all the other markers, such as our markers in the NHS, our markers in surveys, etc., our crime levels and our violence levels, quickly as they once were. They're perhaps levelling of them spiking back up just yet. One of the biggest changes we had was over knife crime. Knife crime absolutely plummeted in Scotland. Now, it's not gone, it's not disappeared. We still have young people stabbing each other. We still have Friday night stabbings. We still have under 18s turning up at an A&E with stab wounds and slash wounds. So the violence in Scotland has not disappeared. It's not gone, it's not eradicated, but it's significantly reduced, particularly amongst the young. What we have seen over the last 10 years is a near 80% reduction in those under the age of 18 carrying a weapon. Now, in terms of carrying weapons and the use of weapons, what we know is if you're carrying a weapon and use a weapon, it's most likely to be a homicide. It's something like a 1 in 50 chance. For every 50 knife attacks, there's a homicide. 1 in 15 for every gun attacks, 1 in 500 for a blunt force attack, and about 1 in 5,000 for an assault. So if you manage to reduce the weapons and access to weapons and the use of weapons, you're going to reduce your homicides, you're going to reduce their serious violence. That's inevitable. But we've had spectacular success in that. Now, a lot of that, we had heavy stop search. Too much stop search at one point, it went through the roof. There is such a thing as too much of a good thing. Because the problem is with too much stop search, what happened was we're damaging police legitimacy. We're searching the same boys and the same girls night after night after night. Sometimes 2 and 3 times a night. These people weren't carrying weapons, they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. And what we were doing was actually damaging police relationships. We weren't actually catching that many people carrying weapons through stop search when we looked at the numbers. At one point, we were stopping more people in the rest of Scotland than we were in London and New York put together. It went out of control. But stop search is a very valuable tactic to use. It's a policing tactic that we need to maintain and we need to use where appropriately. But one of the most startling things when you actually look at the statistics about it are, as you get older, the drop becomes less apparent. And the reason for that is, back in 2008, we started sustained education programs across all our schools, our youth clubs, anywhere that we could touch young people. It was sustained, it was on message, and it was consistent. It wasn't multiple charities coming in and doing multiple and saying multiple different things. It was coordinated from the government. It was a coordinated program that we set out with the government in partnership to deliver, and this went across. We expanded our campus officer network who were delivering similar messages. We had a network of doctors going into schools. It was consistent. We invested in advertising on our buses, in our radio stations, and in our cinemas. We invested heavily in education programs. Now, those that missed the education programs still decreased in levels of violence, but not as much as those in that younger age group, because what they were getting was this double effect, the effect of the education and the effect of the policing. There are 2 components to violence. First of all, your propensity to be violent, the personal factors, and the triggers. Now, Scotland's always had an image of being the drunk, angry man, but alcohol does not make you violent. Alcohol takes away risk, it takes your ability to make good decisions, it's a depressant. If you have that propensity to be violent, and you introduce alcohol into it, then that can result in violence. For me, I get drunk, I fall asleep. I don't start a fight. I never have. So when we look at these two factors, both of them must come into play. What caused the violence and what was within the person. And you have to deal with both. Policing and criminal justice play an important role, but is it just symptom management? This is a crucial question for policing moving forward when tackling any sort of violence problem. If we're looking at what we're doing just now in terms of Operation Sceptre, which is very similar to Safer Scotland, which we did back in 2008, this is about actually tackling a problem at the point of chaos. So we're doing lots of stop searches, or attending to. We're using things like technology in terms of where it be wands and arches and knife amnesties and bins, etc., and targeted hotspot policing. That is necessary. But it can't be all in itself. Because if you deploy a large team of officers to, say, a hotspot area, what happens when you remove them? Because we live with kind of finite utility and a finite number of officers that we can't deploy everywhere at the same time. So we have to make hard decisions. It's almost like quick fixes. Now, that's not to say you won't get quick results, because you will. You absolutely will get quick results. But whether or not it's a sustainable long-term change is a different matter. So at the same time when you're thinking about actually using criminal justice methodology and criminal justice methods, whether it be actually hardcore policing or whether it be actually swift visible justice in terms of actually tackling some of the issues, what else are you doing? What else are you doing to tackle those factors that got you there in the first place? Because if you don't, you'll be back there again in a few months or a year's time, because the problem will just resurface. We have been doing this for now 13 years. We kind of went through different evolutions of this. So first of all, when we look at phase one was absolutely about policing. We come from a policing background. We are part of Police Scotland. We're funded independently by the Scottish Government. But when we first started, we worked for Strathclyde Police and predominantly looked at Glasgow. And it was about policing. It was about police training, the use of metal detectors, the use of policing tactics and capturing DNA, about remand and sentencing policy, using police analysis to its absolute maximum. Swift, visible justice. Making sure that people were turned around the court system fairly quickly. Anti-knife programmes, attitudinal change campaigns, and government buy-in. That's where we were. Now, we still do all that, but we do all that plus other things now. Now, the reason we kind of started at that end, because that's where I come from. I come from an analytical background in policing. A number of the team at the side were like a chief superintendent, a former principal analyst, a sergeant, and it was just the four of us looking at this problem. And we thought, well, actually, if we're going to ask partners to get involved in this, and we're going to legitimately ask people to think differently about how they approach, we must do all that we can do. Because there's no point going to a meeting when partners look at you as if to say, what are you doing? Because we'll get that all the time. We'll turn up to partnership meetings and they will look to the police to deliver. They'll look for the police to take the actions and the police to walk away from it. And we need to stand there and say, we are doing everything that we can. We need support. We need you to step up. And that was as much about that as possible. It was about demonstration. This is what we can do. Now, as we move through that, we recognised that the fact is, this was a public health problem. We didn't know what public health was when we first started. I come from a psychology and criminological background. I have no idea that health had any stake in violence. And when we wrote our first papers, and we wrote our first strategy, a few years later we came across this report from the WHO. And it's about 200 pages long. It's an absolute tomb. It's a bit of a scary read. It's written for doctors. It's not in a very kind of useful language. It's so opposite from what we do in policing, apart from they use different sets of initials than what we do. But when we looked at it, we realised this is what we're doing. This is the approach that we are taking. We just didn't know what it was called. And that approach is simple. It is so simple. If you just take away all the sort of academic nonsense away from it, all the sort of, shall we say, the mythology about it, this is all it is. That's it. There's 2 slides I can sum up public health model for you. This is the first one. First of all, this is absolutely about research and surveillance. And I'm not just talking about crime data, it's about triangulation of all your data sources, all your evidence, everything you have. The more information you have, the more data you have, the better your analysis can be. the better your understanding of what the actual problem is. Not what we think the problem is, what the actual problem is. So sometimes we say it's gangs, because that's where we got hung up in the press, and they seem to be the most prominent in terms of the seriousness of the violence. But actually, when you look at the underneath it, there's lots of other violence going on there that were not necessarily connected to gangs. So you have to understand your problem. Then you have to understand your risk and protective factors. What's causing it? And more importantly, what's stopping it? Because when we look at some of our communities, and we look at everything being equal at it, some of our communities will be more violent than others. There'll be bigger problems with violence in some communities than there is in others. So you have to understand that at that community and individual level, what's stopping it. And when you do that, you innovate and you test. You start off with small programs, small-scale tests to change, and deliver quickly. But also, be prepared to fail. Because this is the most important part about this, and I'll come to this at the end. Failing. We have to fail to learn. But if we fail, we have to fail in the right way. Fail quickly, fail safely, but learn from it. Don't let things drag on if it's not working. So we've done the innovation and test, we scale up and embed. We can't allow it just to be resultant on funding models, because we know that funding is short just now. But if we rely on funding models, what happens is when the funding disappears, the program disappears, the service disappears. We have to think, how do we embed what we want to do in terms of where it be attitudinal change, where it be service delivery work, into everyday core financing, core budgets, core delivery. And this is where it takes mind shift in services. So when we do our innovation and test stuff, we think we're still sitting at that stage going, how is this going to be delivered at a national level, or a county level, or a city level, when the money has gone? And that's key. We learned that lesson hard, and I'll come back to that one. But once you've done all that, what you do is you start again, because you change the problem. These problems aren't fixed. You take, for example, street violence. You put more cops on the street, and the violence moves indoors, or moves off the street. The violence profile changes. How do you police indoors? It's very difficult. Traditional community policing models don't deal with that. Response policing model deals with it after the fact. So you have to think differently about it. And that's when it comes to dealing with attitudes and change and actually trying to identify those you can help. We traditionally work at this level here, the individual. We look at things like across all of our sectors. We look at poor behavioural controls, we look at substance abuse, we look at victim history or violent history, impulsiveness, exclusion from schools. You can name them all when you're looking. There's hundreds of factors when we look at an individual and all the things that kind of add to the risk factors for violence. But the challenge is individuals do not exist in isolation. They exist within relationships. Whether it be parenting, violence within the home, peer group norms, family siblings, role models, masculine culture. They exist within a community. And they exist within society. The challenge that we have got is if we are only addressing it at this level here, the failure rate's really high. Really high. We spend so much money and effort trying to sort out the individual, but all of these areas here cause it to fail. It doesn't fail always, but it fails on a quite high level of a lot of the time. For example, if you look at for someone with a serious drug problem, you take someone with a serious drug problem, you send them away to a clinic in the middle of a leafy countryside, and they come off drugs. But they come out of their clinic all clean, medically clean, still psychologically damaged, but okay, they're medically not addicted anymore. And they go back into the same relationships, the same community, and the same society. And it fails. They go back on drugs again. Now, when we look at these 4 areas here, is it policing's responsibility to tackle all 4 of those? And that's a question we need to ask ourselves. I would suggest it isn't. However, we can set the mood music, we can work with partners, we can work with government, we can work with local government. Because for me, this is not a political issue. This is not about politics, it's not about whatever flavour of party you support. This is about what you want to do and what you want to achieve. When we first started out, we said it would take a generation to change Scotland. We looked beyond the political cycle. Now in Scotland it's perhaps a little bit easier because we've got fairly stable politics in terms of being slightly left of centre, whether it be Labour or SNP. Bit different down in England and Wales when there's a lot more flip-flopping between political ideologies. But policing should be separate to that. Policing needs to work with our communities, hand in hand, to deliver. And if we can work and actually start to deliver across some of the relationship, the community, and society, we can start to impact things. We can start to change the way that communities operate. We can start to work together to do that and not do it alone. This is violence prevention. That's all it is. This is the model that we work to. Enforcement, prevention, and attitudes. That's simple. It's about the policing and it's about justice. It absolutely is about policing and justice. You cannot take that away from that within a public health model. It exists hand in hand together. We have to work in partnership to deliver this. It's also about prevention, primary, secondary, and tertiary. Those before, those on the cusp, and those caught in the absolute chaos of it. Trying to prevent, trying to stop people getting into the levels of violence, trying to stop people joining gangs if that's what we're targeting, and then actually dealing with those in that violence, in that chaos, and helping them actually desist from it and move on. So as we're not continually locking them up and dealing with the further chaos that comes to not only their communities but their own families. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, it's about attitudes. This is about the attitudes of the public, the people that we're dealing with, the communities. Enough is enough in terms of violence. But it's also attitudes of the services. Some of our biggest problems come from services and our attitudes. We live in our silos. We live in a gangs model whereby we don't speak to each other properly, whereby we all have our own KPIs, our own performance measures, and we actually sometimes get in the way with each other and actually think about delivery and what we want to go. So we have to sometimes change our attitudes. This is not about working in partnership with people to get them to deliver your outcomes because you need to deliver your targets. This is about working in partnership to sometimes deliver targets that are not yours. We quickly and early spoke about this. We talked about early years education very early on and what we started doing. When a chief super turned up and didn't make himself entirely popular across Police Scotland or Strathclyde Police at the time and said, I know you're talking about 1,000 extra police officers, but I'd like 1,000 extra health workers instead of the police officers, please. Now, that wasn't entirely popular with the chief constable at the time because they wanted the extra police officers, and I can understand that. But you have to think, what's the utility and what's the benefit? Because actually, there is a limit to having police officers. Now, I think if you go below the level, there's a problem. But if you go too many, you're not getting the same level of impact. So if you have extra upon extra upon extra, are you getting the impact from it? You're not necessarily getting that. You have to look at actually what you want to deliver. So in phase 2 from this, we looked at early years education. We shared the agenda around all our councils and services. We started doing GVI, or the Boston ceasefire model. It was now about research and not about police analysis. It was about attitudinal change campaigns again, but this time it was things like alcohol. We started working with doctors, we started working with parents, and we started really to engage health in this. So we moved on, we moved the agenda on by this stage. Perhaps our most famous project at this time was our gangs intervention model, focused deterrence, which has suddenly got a little bit of notoriety again because of the Centre for Social Justice talking about GVI, which is the same thing. Now, when we looked at the GVI model, it's a carrot and stick approach. Very much about swift, visible justice for those that want to participate in violence or whatever that criminological model is you're looking at. And at the other side for it, equally, ways out. Support, help, attitudinal change. In Scotland at the time, we had this. Boston, 6 or 7 shootings every night. Glasgow, 6 and 7 stabbings. We didn't have the level of firearms, we didn't have the level of problems in terms of, for example, we do in Boston or Chicago, but we had significant levels of violence. One of the things we were most keen on when we looked at gangs was that. I didn't care if you were in a gang. None of us did. Because as I said earlier about gangs and services, we're all in gangs. This is a gang here today. We're in our gangs when we go to our clubs, we're in our gangs with our friends. Gangs are just peer group networks. What I'm interested in is the behaviour. I'm interested in what they do. Not necessarily how they define themselves or how they term themselves. This is about action. So if your gang goes out and plays football, fine. If your gang goes out and runs amok in the streets and starts stabbing people and actually causing violence and mayhem, not fine. So you tackle the behaviour. You don't tackle the network. Not always. Organised crime is maybe slightly different from that. But when we looked at it, looked at the 3 different levels from it. So we looked at peer groups, street gangs, and organised crime. We concentrated on this area here. We took organised crime out of it. Because what we were wanting to do was stop that flow upwards. The organised crime was much more difficult to target. It was much more heavily enforcement. We started off down this end with a 50-50 model, 50% enforcement, 50% intervention. By the time the programme finished, it was about 10%, 90%. Because key to the delivery of this was not necessarily the actual enforcement, it was the threat of enforcement. It was the absolute certainty of threat. But it was also the absolute certainty of support. So when you're working with the young people involved in the street groups and the street gangs, etc., if you said to them, if you step out of line, we're going to hammer you, you do. You absolutely do. Because if you don't, you lose credibility. However, if you're working those same groups and you say to them, if you behave, if you want help and support, we'll help you get jobs, we'll help you get education, we'll help you get whatever you need, you absolutely do as well. Because if you don't, you lose credibility and you miss that opportunity to help someone. So in the end of it, when we started it, we get a number of gangs test us, and the gangs task force absolutely hammered them. But that reduced and reduced and reduced, because they knew that's what would happen. Word got round, they spoke to each other, it was passed round. And in the end, as I said, it was about jobs. It was about education. It was about navigating young people away from the street groups and the street gangs. Now, this programme ran between 2008 to 2012. Do gangs exist in Glasgow, or the street gangs? Yeah, they still do, but at a much reduced number. When you speak to the youth clubs and the organisations still operating in these areas, they talk about it's not what it once was. There's not the constant flow of young people joining gangs and joining this. So things have changed. And it's not just because what we did here, and that started it, but it was a legacy of work that's been done since then by all the third sector delivery agents and the partners, and still in policing as well. Because whatever you do has a legacy effect. And how do you manage that legacy? As I said, we've done enforcement, we've done all the gang analysis, we had the gangs matrix and the gangs network. The gangs matrix was hilarious because we had 2,000 members on it. And then we showed people some of the list, and then we realised 1,000 of them were not gang members. Because what happens is, with police intelligence, you're standing in the wrong place at the wrong time, and all of a sudden an intelligence report goes in about you, and you're marked off as a gang member. And that's what happened. So we had to take 1,000 people off this list. And then we added another 1,000 to it that we knew nothing about in the first place. Because that's the problem that we've got. We don't have the whole picture. We sometimes have the wrong picture. So we went through that whole process. It was group enforcement. It was targeted individual enforcement. But it enabled this, the service deliveries and the programmes. Personal and social development, employability, diversionary, signposting, statutory and third sector. We worked with partners from housing, the fire service, Including, which is one of our big sort of children's charities or youth development charities, Action for Children, who are on that list, the faith groups, the community groups, the private and charitable organisations, Job Centre. We worked with everyone. The programme cost about £1.3 million from the government. However, when we totalled it up, it was probably about £5 million in shared services that came to us. Now, this wasn't new services and wasn't new money, because when you looked at the individuals we're dealing with, they were already engaged with services. What they lacked was coordination. What they lacked was someone to walk them through. When you're working with young men and young women that have real problems with navigating their life anyway, and we expect them to navigate services, we expect them to turn up for appointments when they can't get out of their bed. We expect them to actually do this, that, and the next thing, and they just can't. So we had to help them, we had to support them and take them almost hand in hand. If they wanted that support, in some cases, some of our mentors became surrogate family for them. And this still happens to today. And finally, the moral voice of the community. This is about the communities, the mothers, the fathers, the brothers, the sisters, telling them they care. Telling people that someone actually loves someone may sound a bit soft and woolly, But I've spoken to many gang member and many young man who's been through serious violence in their lives, and actually sometimes you give them a hug and it actually puts a smile on their face and they change, providing they get consistent support. But this is about the community saying that actually we will support you, but you cannot do this. You cannot continue to have this lifestyle. This is impacting upon us. Mothers talking about their sons who went to prison, mothers talking about their sons that died. Because a lot of the young men, their only link in their past and their families is to their mum. It's the only person that generally visits them when they go to prison. Mothers can be an absolute force for good in this, and an absolute force the other way as well. If you've got a mother that's fully engaged and fully want to help and support their son, it's brilliant. If you've got a mother that actually turns around and says to their son, why are you letting him disrespect you like that? You should do something about that. You shouldn't let him speak to you like that. The boy will react to it. So we need to engage with families, and that's what that was about as well. The results were great. Violent offending reduced by just near 50%, as opposed to our test group. Because what happens anyway with these groups, they get older. And as you get older, you transition out of gangs anyway, and you transition out of violence, and you transition out of crime. So we had to test that against what a normal population of this type of groups looked like. So it was a near 50% reduction for violent offending, an 85% reduction in weapons carrying, a near 60% reduction in knife carrying. So it changed the profile across the gangs. And changes in gang fighting down 73%. As we moved on from there, we moved in what's called probably our phase 3 side of this, and we're just coming out of this just now. And this was about things like bystander. Because when we looked at our education programs, what we realized about education programs is education programs work really well in everyone, bar those engaged in it, because they know the consequences of violence, they see it. They know the likelihood of prison because they're friends and perhaps they've been there themselves. They know all this, and we go into schools and we talk about the consequences of violence. They know the consequences of violence better than most of us. But that model doesn't necessarily work. It works with those on the cusp. It works with those who would never probably carry a knife or talk about violence, etc., and it hardens their views. But it doesn't necessarily work on that small 1% or less than 1% there's problems with, the ones most likely to be engaged in it. Now, a few years ago in Scotland, there was a stabbing in a school. A young boy died. And it was in a very nice school. It was a top 10 performing school. It wasn't a kind of school in one of the schemes or housing estates. It was what, top 10. When you looked at it and you actually found out from the report and from the investigation into it, a lot of the kids knew they was carrying a knife. But they didn't know what to do. They didn't know what to say, they didn't know how to speak to him, they didn't know what to do to the teacher. And the report came out quite negative about the kids, and it was almost a wee bit blaming about why didn't the children do something about this. But the reality is, the children weren't going to go to talk to teachers about it. They weren't going to talk to the police about it because of that concept of grassing. But they could have talked to him about it. So what we do in Scotland now is we do bystander modelling. We talk about actually trying to change attitudes in schools and about how schools can safely talk to it. So, for example, it's one thing talking to someone you don't know who's carrying a weapon. You know, you don't know what the response is going to be. But what happens if it's your friend? You know your friend is carrying a knife. How do you have that conversation with them? How do you have that conversation to change their behaviour? And this is about setting a new attitude model within our schools. So we're now in about 130 high schools in Scotland and extending it actually across England and Wales as well. We use bystander approaches in our nightclubs to deal with sexual assault, and our universities to deal with things like sexual consent. We use asset-based approaches in our communities in order to try and include communities in decision making. We do domestic violence modelling, AVDR, which involves things like the fire service, dental service, the beauty industry, speaking to women about violence and about domestic violence in a safe and contained way. Alcohol monitoring, employability, mentoring navigators, which is the same as the red thread model for those of you that have it. It's about procedural justice and fairness. And it's now moved on again from research to research and evaluation and trauma-informed practice about understanding what happened to them. Because if you can understand what happened to people, you get a better chance of working with them. And when we're looking at this, our 4 main programs just now, this is about the teachable and reachable moments. Because if you're working with people with problematic behaviours, you really only get a few opportunities to tackle it. If you approach someone at the wrong time, in the wrong place, in the wrong space, your chance of success is limited. So for example, if you're a domestically violent man and you want help and support because you've just beaten your wife the night before and you're feeling remorseful, and you go and contact people for a service, for a programme delivery, etc., and they say to you, yep, great, we've got a programme for you, but can you come back in 12 weeks' time? Because the programme's not running just now, or it's fully subscribed, but there's a space in 12 weeks. In 12 weeks' time, you come back to that programme, you've not assaulted your wife in that 12 weeks, and you think you're better. You think you don't have the same negative attitudes, you think you don't have the same issues. And you don't go in the programme, or you feel that way a wee bit morally superior to it, so you don't participate in it as much as you would do. You have missed that moment. You have missed that opportunity when you can infect someone's life. The hospital work from the navigators in Glasgow and Edinburgh, or the hospital work in Red Thread throughout the country, is about that teachable, reachable moment. It's about people sitting in pain thinking about the consequences of what they had. And how can we engage with them? Now, not everyone engages. It's not like this magical panacea where you're sitting in hospital and being stabbed and think, I need to change my life. But it gives you an opportunity. And we need to think, how can we capitalise on those opportunities in the work that we do? Is it the work we do in custody, when someone's in a police cell? Is it work we do in prison? Is it work we do in communities through our community officers? And we need to think differently about how we can reach people. Because it's hard work. It doesn't happen overnight. There's lots of failure with this. They will tell you to go away in colourful language. They will tell you they're not interested. You're just police. And you have to stick with it, because you can change people. And people do change. And they change in sometimes the most spectacular ways. Most of our mentors have came through that lifestyle. And a number of you will know people that have worked in that lifestyle are now going in and training and teaching people. If we think that people's life course is fixed, that's a bit of a fallacy. Life courses aren't fixed. We can change at any time. It just takes hard work. If you think about it every new year when we make a New Year's resolution, how many times do we fail? So we expect someone that's coming out of gangs, we expect someone coming out of crime to actually change their life straight away? No. But we've got to stick with it. Because what's the alternative? The alternative is to go back to prison and cost £39,000 a year? It's really expensive. The alternative is to commit more violence and someone dies? Horrific. We need to institute change. These are our navigators here in the kind of Beatles-esque pose. We've got this man at the front who's brilliant, ex-army. He's built like a side of a house, heart of a teddy bear, can engage with anyone. And that's the important thing. We chose those people. We didn't choose them on their qualifications. We didn't choose them on their work history. We choose them on their experience and their ability to communicate with people. Kate mentioned at the start about spectacular people doing spectacular things. These are the type of people that would sit on a park bench and all of a sudden a crowd would be around them talking to them, sharing their life story with them. It's that ability to connect with people that allows change. This is our MVP programme, their schools-based programme. We've got now 6,000 mentors in Scotland delivering this. 6,000 young people actively engaged. The MVP model is particularly good because what it does is actually gives it ownership to the school. It doesn't rely on an expert model going in and continually spending money and training. It allows it to exist within the school and grow within the school. All we do is provide the resources, and they self-train and they self-deliver. So it's a sustainable model. We've got our social enterprise. We've now opened up 2 more businesses with this, and that's about employing people with criminal histories. What we realised about employment, and we learned this from our gangs programme, was employment is just not enough in by itself. Because if you're chaotic and you can't survive a lifestyle that normally we get up at 9 o'clock, 7 o'clock in the morning, go to work for 9, or if you're a police officer, you're there for 7 o'clock in the morning. We're used to that. We're used to the rules. These guys aren't. They get a job, they turn up day 1, turn up day 2 late, and don't turn up day 3. They don't realise you need to go back. You don't realise when you get paid, you're supposed to pay your bills. You're not supposed to go and spend it all on trainers and jeans. So you have to work with them. So it's a 12-month mentoring programme to support them. And when they come out of that, they go and find jobs elsewhere. Because this is about preparing people not just for jobs, but for life. How many of you heard of ACEs? It's now the big talking point. ACES is one of the most important things in Scotland just now. It features for our criminal justice framework, it features in our health framework, our education framework, and it also features in our new programme for government. ACES is basically a common language that we can use to speak across all of the areas. And what ACES are simple. What happens is the more of these ACES you have, the more problems you can have in life. If you have 4 or more ACES, and we'll come to what they are next, you're more likely to die from alcoholism, you're more likely to have smoking problems, you're more likely to attempt suicide, you're more likely to have heart disease, you're more likely to have drug abuse, you're more likely to be a victim of crime, you're more likely to have liver disease, victim of sexual assault, antidepressant prescriptions from having 4 or more of these problems in early years. And these are common to those working in child protection or safeguarding. Physical abuse, psychological abuse, sexual abuse, emotional neglect, physical neglect, loss of parent, mother treated violently, substance abuse, mental illness, criminal behaviour in the household. 4 of those or more, your life course is significantly, potentially different, but not for all. It doesn't mean if you've got these, your life is knackered. It really doesn't. Because what we need to wrap around it is how do we support people? And there's some evidence coming out of Wales just now in terms of resilience, in terms of how it impacts people. But across society, in terms of numbers, how this looks. About 35% of society have 0 of these. And about 12% have 4 or more. So that's across whole of society. If you look at youth justice, it's that. None of them have 0. Over about half of them have 4 or more. So when we look at how people got there, they were essentially made. There were essentially things going on in their past that actually led them to that point. And if you look at that there, that doesn't, what I'm not saying is when you go to like a criminal justice, it doesn't excuse what you do in terms of your actions. So say you have 4 or more or 8 ACEs and you commit homicide. There's an understanding of how you got there as a person, but it does not excuse what you do. And that's the important aspect about it. But also the important thing about this is just because you know the number, that's actually irrelevant. The importance is what can you do to support. And the work that's coming out of Wales just now shows this in terms of schoolwork. Now, what you've got here is absenteeism from school and poor health. So those with 4 or more, 31% absence level. Poor health, 60%, 4 or more. If you introduce some of the resilient protective factors, so for example, for school absenteeism, it's treating kids fairly and giving them opportunities, that drops to 13%. If it's poor childhood health, and you have role modelling, opportunities and supportive friends, it goes from 60 to 21%. Now, this, granted, is for school kids. It's looking at performance within schools, it's looking at absenteeism, it's looking at a whole number of factors. However, we can equally apply this across criminal justice. If we actually can have proper role modelling, proper mentoring, proper support, give people opportunities, how could that affect young people's outcomes in, say, joining gangs? How could that affect young people's outcomes in getting involved in the drugs trade or becoming addicted or becoming alcoholics? Or getting involved in this, that, and the next thing. We have an opportunity to take learning cross-sector and actually think to ourselves, how can we prevent? How can we change people's life courses? And we absolutely can, but only collaboratively. We're now at this stage, targeting the hard to reach and the hard to change. As I said, violence is almost plateaued in Scotland. Still coming down, perhaps. There's some debate about that. But what we know is over 50% of our violence and crime is about 0.85% of our population responsible for. 0.85% of the population of Scotland is about 45,000 people. 45,000 people responsible for half your crime. That's a manageable number. But what that doesn't mean, that's 45,000 people that need to go to prison. Some of them will. Some of them absolutely will, because they'll committed crimes so horrible and they're absolutely dangerous to society. But most of those people will need support. The families will need support in order to change. This is about service delivery within our third sector. It's about delivery within our social work sector, within our health, within our education, within our employment services, to give people that opportunity to support them. We have to be more targeted now. We can deal with that universal stuff, the universal education, universal approaches to policing, universal approaches to health and education, so on and so forth. But actually, we need to target. We need to identify, we need to share, and we need to share what we do with each other in order to help and support. We need to work with them and not against them in order to engender change. If we can do that on an almost case-by-case basis, I don't care if we went house to house to do this. We can make significant changes. It could cost us a lot of time and a lot of effort, but we could actually really make a significant difference. To do this, you need a level of empathy. You need a level of prototyping, and you need a level of openness. You have to understand what the problem is. You have to test your solutions, as I said at the very start, and you have to be transparent in what you do to understand the problem. You have to be comfortable with uncertainty. Some of us just aren't comfortable with uncertainty. You know, if you do something, is it going to have an impact? Don't know, I'm not going to make it worse. That was actually supposedly going to be the strapline for the Violence Reduction Unit when we started. Our strapline is violence is preventable, not inevitable. And we did actually subtitles going, we can't make the problem any worse. And I sometimes think that's probably the best marker that we can have in what we do. Are you making the problem better or worse? Rather than think, well, I'm doing X amount of actions, I'm having X amount of cops deliver this, I'm having X amount of stop searches, I'm taking X amount of knives from the streets. The question is, did you make it better? And if you can legitimately turn around and say yes, then yes. If you can say, don't know, then perhaps you haven't. Lead, don't follow. That's crucial. Take a stance. Take a stance in what you want to do and take a stance in what you want to deliver. And I said at the very couple of slides back, embrace your failures. Absolutely embrace them. I could do a whole lecture on failures and problems and challenges that we've had and tests that we've done that have not quite worked out. And yeah, some of them were actually quite funny. But we need to learn from them. Don't hide them. Because if you hide them, and the problem that we had in the past is programs never failed. They suffered from organisational drift. And then what happens is a few years later, someone comes back and does it again because it never failed. They haven't learned from it. We need to learn. And encourage your staff to learn from their failures and be open about it. I love this quote. Absolutely love this quote from Obama. I often think about, it's a shame it's not a Trump quote because there's not enough greats in it. We can't do well serving our communities if we believe that we, the givers, are the only ones that are half full and that everyone we're serving is half empty. There are assets and gifts out there in our communities, and our job as good servants and good leaders is having the ability to recognise those gifts in others and help them put into action. This is not about this room having the answers. It's not about having this conference having the answers. This is about the answers from people on the street. This is about the answers from the officers in the front line. This is about listening to people and taking action. This is about bottom-up learning and not top-down direction. And that's the best way we can do this. Listen from the very ground and work our way up. Don't start at a strategic level. Strategy is dead easy. I can sit in a room and draw a strategy today for the whole violence for the UK. It'd be lovely boxes with lots of arrows pointing to different services. Totally undeliverable, but it would look great. Start from the bottom and work your way up. And ask yourself those three questions. Who are you? What do you do? And why does it matter? This is not about job roles. This is not about your occupation. This is about why does it matter to you? Does it matter to you that young people are killing each other? Does it matter to you there's domestic violence? Does it matter to you that kids have been bullied? If it doesn't, you're probably in the wrong job. If it does matter to you and you want to change, then we've got an opportunity to change. But it's tough. It's a long journey. But we've been doing it for 10 years now, and we're probably not going to stop. Thank you.